Vancouver, British Columbia, the promise of a great city. Wooden shacks have been replaced by solid buildings. Let's follow it down through the years and discover, through the curious eyes of countless cameras, Vancouver and her people.
You get people saying, well, Vancouver isn't very old. It doesn't have really any history. It doesn't have any heritage. Look, it's only 125 years old. The point is that things don't get old if you don't look after them when they're new.
I think maintaining heritage buildings and heritage structures in the city is important. It helps maintain our architectural legacy, so the buildings, the forms, and it's also about the social and cultural history. And maintaining those stories about people or activities is equally important, I think, as the buildings themselves.
Just by charting the transformations of a building type, you can actually begin seeing different patterns, and you can begin assuming what neighborhoods are changing and why they're changing and how they're changing.
I think every building has a story. You know, it's an artifact, and some are considered works of great art, and some are just considered just sort of the detritus of you know, human occupation. But to me, they're all interesting, and they're all pretty equally interesting.
Heritage today, in large part, is taking sort of the best of the past and trying to preserve it.
We really didn't know the area, but all of a sudden here we were in this new Cedar Cottage area that just felt like another city to us, didn't it, Jerry?
Yes, absolutely. It
Yeah.
felt like we were in Europe somehow.
And that was when we were charmed by this building on the corner. And we said, oh, too bad that's not for sale. And then was it on the way back we saw the real estate agent had put up a for sale sign.
On this building.
On this building right here. And we thought, wow, isn't that great? And then we started talking about it, and we thought, oh, you know, I bet what's going to happen is that a developer is going to come in, buy it, demolish it, it was on a double lot, and put up a condo. And we were kind of, I don't know, bewitched or smitten. We just decided to, right then and there, just to make an offer and buy it. We didn't have a budget or a business plan or a long-term vision other than that we wanted to save it.
In Vancouver, a smaller yet important part of the transportation history revolves around the interurban freight and passenger services, which spread out from the city in many directions.
The absolute state-of-the-art rapid transit system that ran between Vancouver and New Westminster had been around for about 20 years. And one of the spots where it looked like it might be a good place for a community to form was around what became Cedar Cottage. A station was put there around the turn of the 20th century. And houses sprang up, and buildings, including the Gow Block, were built along Commercial Street. There was a bank building, there were, you know, a number of stores. All of these things have a little suburban community, and its main connection with Vancouver, for most people around 1910, wouldn't have been this railway system and then the streetcar system that was pushing out towards it.
They zoned it light industrial, so it kind of ruined it as a little village. Instead of a little streetcar stop with a bunch of businesses in the middle and housing around the edge with automobile, you get Kingsway, which is just continuous businesses all the way to New Westminster and housing on either side, but there's no center, there's no beginning, there's no end, and there's no neighborhoods. There's just a strip development. So that's the opposite of pre-automobile, which was you had little villages with a middle and an outer edge, and people living within 5 minutes of the center where the streetcar stopped.
Over time, it's changed. The interurban ceased to run through there. Yeah, the Gow Block had been altered many times over the years, but the current owners actually did a fabulous job in restoring the building back to its original conditions for the most part, but adapting it today to make it more modern and being livable.
We had thought that initially we would just fix it up bit by bit, but we started doing it that way, and Jerry and our sons and some of their friends would come over and work, like pulling down the stucco, and there was a lot of garbage. It was a mess.
The foundation was rotted, and as we got into it, it became more and more extensive, and we had to redefine the size of the project, which became completely gutting the building, upgrading seismically, upgrading mechanically. All the plumbing is renewed, all electrical is renewed. It became a complete refurbishing, and that involved then lots of help, that being architects, mechanical engineers, structural engineers, and the whole gambit, and a lot of involvement of the city and inspections. And it assured, as a result, it assured that the result was sound, and it took 2 years, and the Gal Block emerged. The phoenix flew. These are the bay windows, which were a very characteristic part of the building restoration and essential to the city to approve this as a heritage building. This hallway is a lovely hallway with the original fir floors, and a lot of attention was actually paid to replacing the wood, which was quite degenerated and heavily painted, with the exact same profile that was originally in the building in the 1920s. And the bathrooms were restored.
We wanted to restore.
The bathtubs were refinished and left as is, and we did retile all the bathrooms as we imagined they would have been. And we were very happy to be able to leave the original stairs and banister that we found that were from the building initially. And I always enjoy walking up these stairs because I think of tens of thousands, so many people have had their hands on this banister and have walked these steps.
We were approached by Jerry and Nora, the owners of the Gal Block, who had just were just finishing renovation of the old building. Basically, they were given the right to develop the rest of the property, which otherwise they wouldn't have been able to do it, at least not at the densities that they were looking at. We took actually a very straightforward approach of looking at 5 very narrow row houses that would fit snugly on the back lane and create a courtyard between the old building and some sort of dialogue between the old building and the new row houses.
It's interesting the way that the two buildings meld. The city had very defined ideas about how the look of that additional building should be. They wanted a contrasted architectural look, but they wanted features brought in. So the trim, the molding was the same, and the colors were the same. We had to restore the initial staggered doorway of a traditional building from it's 1908. This building was, we have photos of it, the initial construction from 1908. So that was done from these photos.
And I contacted the Vancouver Heritage Foundation, and basically I wanted to pick their brains about colors for the exterior. They were great. They had a color expert come out and do a scraping to find out what the original colors were. And they arranged for us to get what was called a True Colors grant through Benjamin Moore Paint. And they also were so supportive and positive of what we were doing that they gave us that little boost that we needed.
Having been by the site in the last few months, I think the conclusion and the final product is quite spectacular, and they certainly deserve a lot of credit for persevering and persisting through the processes and all the challenges, because I think it's a really important example, and it sets a great case study. It's a great opportunity to show people how to preserve a building, build new, and it all fits in within a community context and neighborhood context.
In perpetuity, this building will look the way you see it now. If it got burnt down, we've agreed that it'll be rebuilt with the exact same appearance. So the community is assured of some history long term.
We're committed to the Gal Block and this project, this
Well, that's not
neighborhood
going
for the
anywhere.
long term.
No.
I mean, you know, we're just, and we have family living here, and so we love this building. And I like the fact that there's a little corner cafe where people can meet, and you see people pushing their strollers and grandparents coming in, and they even have live music nights downstairs. And so it's a lively building, and I think that we feel good that we've done something positive for the neighborhood.
There's a lot of bad ideas in the 70s, apparently. So the Vancouver Special was one of them, it seemed. Like, they're stucco boxes, you know?
Like, I think they were seen as ugly partly because of the way that they were decorated, which tended to be a multicolored glazed brick and a little bit of aluminum trim on them, and the rest of them was stucco. All of this meeting the new bylaw need for fireproofing. And a lot of people would just look at them, and compared with the textures of the old houses, the articulated facades, the framing around the windows and everything, they looked really cheap. They looked really nasty.
They were reproduced ad nauseum across the city, so they would get a bit tiresome. I mean, a lot of people maybe think Vancouver Specials are beautiful, but honestly, I don't. I think they fall short in a number of ways, but they almost are. And I feel that they're redeemable aesthetically and kind of functionally.
Nobody wanted to talk about them except as a problem. They're ugly or they're too big. They're essentially a design problem that maybe architects could fix somehow. But it's clear that there's a lot more to them than that, because just the sheer number of them, they had an impact on so many people's lives.
There's a shared sense of experience that comes from living in a Vancouver Special that's uniquely Vancouver, and that cuts across so many diverse communities and unites us in a way.
A couple of builders in the 1960s get the idea that if they just got rid of the stairs altogether, and instead of going up to the main floor, you went down into the house off that, you could save all that money. You have an internal staircase, and voila, the Vancouver Special is born. And then they look at how can they make it just as inexpensive as possible to build. Well, you do it with an almost flat roof. You get this volume that is as big as possible. And then in the technicalities of the bylaw at that time, that space that you walk down into, that basement space, wasn't counted in the square footage. And so they would blow the house back on the lot and out to the sides as much as they could. And you get these enormous houses that were really good for the extended families of new immigrants coming into Vancouver in the post-war years.
Like in 1910, Vancouver was 90% immigrants from England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, but mostly England and Scotland. You can look at the 1911 census. People were either born in Great Britain or their parents were born in Great Britain. So it was a very, very British place. Now that didn't change so much until 1967. Trudeau changed immigration laws. It used to be basically if you weren't British, they wouldn't let you into the country. Now, when they sort of made the system the same for everybody, you got massive immigration from China and then later on from India.
I always have these great fond memories of the Vancouver Special, in a couple of ways, perhaps. One maybe academic, and one more as a personal one. In sort of an academic way, and we've talked about how these diverse communities of migrants would move into these Vancouver Specials. And it sort of speaks to me at a geographic level in terms of space, and also sacred space in a sense, because you have these diverse group of migrants, Eastern European, South Asian, Asian as well, who all live in a similar house structure, and it really redefines the sense of home. And for migrant communities, defining home, defining a place to be is so important. So in that sense, all these diverse communities go back to their homes that are all built the same and used in similar ways, and those attachments are built in similar ways. I think that's really important speaking to Vancouver and how Vancouver has viewed Vancouver Specials in the sense that it crosses so many different boundaries and creates that sense of home and identity. But personally for me, I mean, it's tied so much with my childhood. In the area, on the 2 blocks around our house, there are a lot of Vancouver Specials and large trees, great places to walk, great sense of community that was there. I remember there were other Fijian migrants in that area, also some Chinese and Vietnamese migrants as well too. So in that sense, it was a very diverse place, and we always sort of mingled together and had barbecues in the backyard, and we played basketball in the backyard. It was just a great place to be.
If there are things that are worth recognition, in my humble opinion, it would be those that affect it to the extent that it transforms places and it creates identities and it creates different neighborhoods. And something like the Vancouver Special lies perfectly within that realm.
The thing that sort of excites me about renovation in terms of architecture is the idea of taking something that's either not working or almost working, or somehow perfect but not quite, and reworking it or adjusting it so it suits a new generation of users.
We liked Vancouver Specials right from the beginning because we knew that they had lots of square footage, and with our young family, we knew that that's what we needed, lots of room. So Sean went on a mission to find us a Vancouver Special.
Mm-hmm. And with our company, again, we wanted to do a renovation that could show a situation where we introduce sustainability as well as affordability into a renovation, and then use our family as guinea pigs to test it out afterwards.
The Vancouver Special is one of their biggest attributes, and one of the reasons why I think it's maintained itself so long is that it actually maximizes the square footage. If you were to take a typical one down, chances are you'd actually have to build a smaller footprint house. Real estate values being calculated as they are based on square footage, it's almost a no-brainer to keep them and maintain them and renovate them.
When it comes to what we took out, there was really 2 walls. We moved a couple of door openings. The drywall had to come off and the insulation, and some of the exterior cladding. And there wasn't a lot of typical construction waste that would have occurred from a typical teardown because of the bones that you get from a Vancouver Special.
We wanted to maintain the fact that this has a rentable suite. It's big, it's wonderful. We don't want to transform it into a single family home. We want to actually maintain it as it was because it works so well for that.
We installed double pane fiberglass windows. We installed a high efficiency fireplace in the upstairs. We changed out the furnace and put in HRV, which is a heat recovery ventilator. So we've got fresh air in all the rooms. We got rid of the hot water tank and put in an on-demand hot water tank. So we have the original ceiling, the beautiful wood, but we also have 3 windows that brings in morning sunlight into the space.
When you actually get in your house and you have your family, all that hard work is worth it. And it really gives you a sense of accomplishment. You were economical and sustainable, and you really put your heart and soul into it. And
I think we've created a lovely home that we get to raise two lovely daughters and enjoy what the community offers.
The Vancouver Special is a unique creation of our crazy city. And, as such, and I think the interest that people are beginning to put into them now, 2 generations since they started to come up, indicates that they are beginning to get a little bit of a heritage cred.
But it certainly speaks to a social and cultural time as well as architectural development in the city. So by being such a functional building form in the rectangular shape, it allows for lots of adaptability and reuse, which is another important aspect in terms of achieving sustainability goals in the city.
I actually love what's happening now with the changes that are taking place in sort of deconstructing the former Vancouver Specials and rebuilding them in sort of iconic parts. Whether it's that dark gray exterior with stucco or with wood paneling on the outsides on the fences. I kind of like how it's being reinterpreted for modern day Vancouver. I love that way that Vancouver Special is such a useful tool, that it can be a useful tool, a mythic tool, such a strong symbol that is strong enough to be deconstructed and rebuilt into something else that becomes relevant for another time period. Vancouver Specials, I think, really do reflect the changing stories of the city, and I think there's a great opportunity there for Vancouver Specials to be seen as in dialogue with how the city changes and views itself.
The Laneway house itself is an evolution of a building form that's been done in the city for multiple years. So you could build infill or larger laneway houses, as they're called now, in many of the historic areas, heritage neighborhoods like Mount Pleasant or Kitsilano or Strathcona. The laneway has helped or evolved to help preserve existing buildings, or when new buildings are built, it's providing more of an opportunity to create some affordable or rental housing.
Vancouver really took off in about 1907. There was a huge worldwide building boom up until 1913, then everything collapsed. So all these old, what you call heritage houses today, Almost all of them in Grandview, Mount Pleasant, Kitsilano, they're all built, almost all built then. In the early years, guy would build a small house for himself. A lot of them were carpenters, they'd build a house for themselves. And maybe at the back of the lot or at the front of the lot. And then later on, because these lots are 120 feet long, they would move the house to the back and get married, let's say, and have kids and build a big house at the front of the lot. Quite often you had grandparents that came over, like all at once, and all lived together in a house. So it wouldn't be unusual back then, especially when you got 12 kids or 10 kids, that was normal, that you might have the grandparents, I guess, living in the cottage in the back, and in the front you'd have 5 kids and parents.
The way houses were built 100 years ago, the lots were so much more permeable visually. It was so much more of a shared landscape because the fences were lower. The houses had front porches. People hung their laundry out at the back. People tended to live more outdoors and so on. And so perhaps children would play in the lanes, or they would be playing on the streets, or they would be going back and forth. Laneway houses were never common in Vancouver, but there were enough of them around that you can track the places where they were. And particularly in the oldest neighborhoods of Vancouver in Strathcona, they were the most common of all in Strathcona, because Strathcona was an absolute free-for-all. Small-scale, greedy capitalism at its best, where people would, they'd buy a lot and they'd just say, how many houses can I put on this lot? And so you can see that often in the case of 2 or 3 houses jammed in, or often you'll have a main house and then a little house on the lane, something like a granny cottage, a granny flat. All the little guys, all the speculators and everything created these wonderfully cool neighborhoods like Grandview that are, really made it into the kind of vibrant, artsy, politically hip community that it is.
I've always really liked urban areas and little infill projects that people do in urban settings. So I traveled a lot when I was younger, and you'd be in places, whether it was in Asia or Europe. And it was always sort of those little back alleys that you would find these really charming, created environments. When I moved to Vancouver around 2000, and I was working in older areas of the city doing renovation work, and there'd be those little houses and little cottages that were sort of starter homes for people back 120 years ago, 100 years ago. It really caught my imagination that if Vancouver was going to grow, which it was under a lot of pressure to do, this was going to be a way to really keep the texture of the communities and at the same time create more housing stock.
Yeah, the lane houses have been named as a gentle densification of neighborhoods. That was Michael Geller's term. Michael Geller, the architect and pundit and the developer in his own right, and yeah, obviously an idea that is really working for some people.
Close to 4 years ago, we heard that laneway houses were a possibility. At the time, we had a cement pad that sat four cars could park there, and we had 2 cars, so that didn't make a lot of sense. And it seemed like such a waste having a big cement pad in the back. So we were contemplating putting a garage in, maybe expanding it with just grass so the kids could play. Then when we heard about the Laneway house, we started looking into that and thought it was a great idea as a potential investment property. At the time, there was one main group advocating for it, Smallworks, and we were able to talk to them, sit down with them, and came up with some plans, and it just basically went from there.
When we talk about green spaces and use of space, David's house is a great example. You have this small residence that houses a family very effectively, and we were able to create another small residence that housed a family. In fact, the people who moved in there quite shortly afterwards had a child, which was great to see this young family have this opportunity. And then creating a courtyard between the 2 buildings where one could quite easily imagine a very safe play area for these families to have.
It's definitely not something you would do for short-term investment. It's a long-term investment. Definitely something you don't do to make money off right off the bat. It basically, more or less pays for itself, almost. And that's what I looked at it for, was just a long-term investment. So perhaps after it is paid off, it might be a small, modest little income, or maybe by that time my kids will be able to move into it, or even my kids actually might kick mom and dad out, and we might actually end up living there at some point in the future. We went through a few designs that Smallworks had, and this one was the most that seemed to fit our profile the most with our house. Our house is about 70 years old. So we wanted something that didn't look modern. We wanted something that was more of a classic type look. So we went with a carriage style house, and we think it fits in quite well with the neighborhood and fits in well with Grandview Woodlands. You know, my opinion is, you know, let's keep what's here, let's keep the heritage here, and Laneway helps to provide that. We can create some densification, but in addition, keep the existing homes and the existing heritage there. So we think it's a perfect fit for the city of Vancouver, rather than tearing everything down, putting in new condos, and we lose a lot of the history in Vancouver.
I think people recognize the value of heritage houses and the fact that we have really good housing stock that's been taken down almost every day in Vancouver, and this is a way to mitigate that. The biggest change we've seen with Laneway housing is that it's captured people's imagination around living small. I think there is a fundamental sea change happening within both urban planners and developers, but more importantly, I think it's really driven by a need and a kind of a new wave in the populace.
I think having great big monster homes will start to go away for a lot of different reasons here in Vancouver. First of all, the affordability of them. To afford any house in Vancouver is getting to be cost prohibitive for most people. So smaller homes make a lot more sense.
You know, when you start looking at land that's set aside for car, which includes laneways, people's front yards to some extent, and certainly roadways, the car owns a big proportion of the single-family neighborhood, well into the 40%.
If you get back to say, well, how do we design cities for people instead of cars? What you do is you downplay everything to do with cars and you upplay people. What works is a lot of interactions and diversity.
I think a lot of people that have Laneway houses, it's, you know, we sometimes believe in something a little bit different. You know, we're not car-centric ourselves, our family. A lot of us cycle quite a bit, so we try and limit the amount of cars we have on the property. Once I moved over here, I really started to feel a sense of community, people getting together all the time for barbecues, you know, the occasional block party. So it's definitely really changed the landscape, I think.
Looking ahead, in kind of an ideal way, you know, it may not unfold this way, but ideal way, we'd lovely to see a number of these lanes that we have in the city in key areas become much more of public muses. The laneways are this way to kind of create a really lovely landscape that's atypical from what we have now, which facilitates a shift in our value system that we're seeing reflected in other green initiatives.
People are making individual choices. People say, I want to live in an old house. Nobody's forcing them to do it. There are lots of opportunities to live in new houses or new condos or whatever. But what we've got, we should look at saving and keeping that as one of the options for people in the city. Our values as a society are expressed partly through the retention of these neighborhoods.
Where it goes in the future, I don't know. There's always going to be some new ugly development that people object to, and that maybe 40 years in the future, we get used to it. It becomes part of our landscape. We start to see some value in it.
The neat thing about moving forward is hopefully you keep the best of the past and you get rid of the stuff that's not so great. And then hopefully you do something better today because we have more technology, more knowledge, more resources, more everything, that we can make things better.
Whether it's the built form or whether it's the social and cultural development of the city, that is part of our heritage, and those are the kinds of things that I think we all should be working towards trying to preserve.